noted, and I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise and to speak on the Closing the Gap report and acknowledge, and in so doing acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and the continent we share, and thank them, the elders past, present and future, for their continuing stewardship. The place that I call home always was, is now and always will be Aboriginal land, and I acknowledge the keepers of the world's oldest cultures and traditions generally, but specifically wanted to mention two of my friends that I caught up with out in St George in January, Peter Brown and Wayne Long. I hadn't caught up with Wayne Long for a while, about 10 years. He took me on a car trip that I think took about 10 years off my life. But I do say a special hello to Wayne and Peter. Obviously, the Closing the Gap report is a very important event for this parliament, as is the work done by many other committees in terms of trying to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. I just wanted to mention two of the reports I've been involved with on committees. One at the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee that I chaired, looking into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, the report called FASD, The Hidden Harm, and the other report chaired by Shane Newman for Blair called Doing Time, Time for Doing, looking at Indigenous youth in the criminal justice system. Those inquiries and the inquiry I'm currently on as part of the Indigenous Affairs Committee looking into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educational achievements, both very informative. Obviously, I started this speech by acknowledging the traditional owners, but I particularly wanted to do that on this as we come into the 10th anniversary of the Closing the Gap initiative, where that change from fine words to practical deeds, because there has been an enormous amount of work done over the past 10 years to help eliminate Indigenous disadvantage. I acknowledge the work of the communities, the private sector and non-government organisations in this endeavour, and both sides of the political spectrum. The Closing the Gap report 2016 was delivered to the Parliament by the Prime Minister this week, and I particularly note his opening remarks in where he chose the local Indigenous language to deliver that. That was a fine choice. Unfortunately, after that, the words he delivered were confronting for Australia, where we sadly find out that only 2 of the 7 targets, achieving the targets will close the gap. Only 2 of those 7 targets are unfortunately on track. So we did want to focus on the good news there, that the child mortality has declined 33% between 1998 and 2014. That is a good thing. Obviously, the target is for child mortality to halve by 2018, and we are on track for that, to achieve that target. And obviously, I would like to see us go beyond that target to reduce child mortality in Indigenous Australians. The attainment of a Year 12 or equivalent education standard in Indigenous Australians aged 20 to 24 years is still on track to be halved by 2020. However, there is no updated data from the last report, so it is hoped that progress is still continuing for this target. Sadly, the other 5 targets, the news is not so good. The target for Indigenous 4-year-olds in remote communities to be enrolled in early childhood education has not been met by the expiration, and the new target is for 95% of 4-year-olds to be enrolled in early childhood education by 2025. We know as parents how important early childhood education is. This is a very important target because it will set up communities for years and years beyond. So I hope these figures improve quickly. Still on education, something I'm particularly passionate about, having been an English teacher for 11 years. Still on education, the target for school attendance of non-Indigenous children recorded an improvement, but sadly only an improvement of less than 1%. This does not come close to meeting the target of closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous school attendance within 5 years. So more needs to be done there. The gap between reading and numeracy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students was to be halved by 2018. The sort of mixed progress when it comes to this. NAPLAN reports show that only 4 of the 8 areas measured, are students on track. Obviously, as a teacher, particularly passionate about English and reading, but so I am slightly biased, but I consider education is the key to future success for all students, and let's hope that next year we have better results coming through. The next target may be a direct reflection of the slow progress being made in education, and that is the gap to have the gap in employment outcomes halved by 2018. And sorry to report there has been a decline in employment outcomes since the 2008 baseline was established. And that horrible statistic, the closing the gap in life expectancy, still there has been some longer term progress, but it's been limited. These are obviously all very important issues for Indigenous Australians. They're issues that the Parliament, everyone in the Parliament, I would suggest, cares about, and we all want to improve. And it's good to see support broadly on both sides of the aisle, although I did note that unfortunately 2/3 of the government weren't able to stay for Bill Shorten's speech, where he actually put forward some great policy initiatives. We already announced our new education policy, Your Child, Our Future, which is about guaranteeing the individual attention and targeted programs for all students, and particularly Indigenous students, so that we can make sure that they do their best at school. That education policy, if rolled out, will do much to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. It will give every child in every school every opportunity they need to succeed. There is no greater gap in our community than between the incarceration rate of Indigenous men and non-Indigenous men. If you're Indigenous, you are 15 times more likely to be in prison than if you are non-Indigenous. As I mentioned, this report again, Doing Time for Doing, chaired by the member for Blair, detail that, in terms of going to prisons, interviewing stakeholders. It was quite a moving experience. For Indigenous women, who now make up 15% of our female prison population, there has been a 74% increase in incarcerations in the past 15 years. Staggering statistics, because you know of the lives that are changed forever by people going to prison, and then the effects linger for years and years and years. The re-imprisonment rate for Indigenous young people is higher than the school retention rate. Obviously, this is a disgrace, and it reflects badly on this Parliament and every Commonwealth representative. Labor has committed to set new targets to close the justice gap at the first COAG meeting under a Labor government. These targets will tackle these disgraceful incarceration rates, preventing crime, reducing violence and victimisation, and boosting community safety. And I want to particularly acknowledge the Queensland Attorney-General, Yvette D'Arth, who has taken the initiative of reinstating some of the intervention strategies rather than only relying on incarceration for Indigenous Queenslanders. It's hard to believe that Indigenous Australians are 6 times more likely to suffer from blindness than non-Indigenous Australians. This is even more shocking when you realise that Australia leads the world when it comes to eye health. The amazing work of Fred Hollows and Vision 2020 in our country is noted, but we still have Indigenous people who are suffering from preventable or treatable eye conditions and going blind. Trachoma is an infectious and wholly preventable eye disease which only exists among our Indigenous population effectively. It is present in 2/3 of remote communities here in Australia, not overseas, but here in Australia. We are the only developed nation in the world where trachoma still exists. That is embarrassing and surely something we need to do more to confront. There are in a nation that prides itself on the healthcare delivered and universal healthcare access, we need to do more to eliminate trachoma. So, to address this issue, Labor has committed to an additional $9 million to close the gap in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander vision loss. Obviously, then there are benefits that flow through to communities in terms of people being able to have productive jobs, people being able to, rather than care for someone, they can return to school or be involved in schools, and that the economic benefits flow easily. So this money, committed to by Labor leader Bill Shorten, will be invested in optometry and ophthalmology services and prevention activities to close the gap in eye health and eliminate trachoma once and for all in Australia. To completely close the gap, we also need to recognise our first Australians in our Constitution. They need to have their names on our birthing document, effectively. Labor is committed to a referendum on Indigenous recognition within the first year of taking office.